Hello, we're going to look at elasticity in this presentation, specifically price elasticity of demand. So these are the specification objectives for price, income and cross elasticity of demand, but in this presentation we're only going to be looking at calculating price elasticity of demand, the relationship between PED and firms' revenue, the factors that influence these elasticities of demand, and interpreting the values as well. So very important when looking at all types of elasticities is that you can actually calculate percentage change. Most students get this part of the course wrong or get questions on this wrong just because they haven't worked out percentage change properly. So remember that the equation for percentage change is change over original times 100 if you're turning it into the percentage. And we'll have a look at that in a sec. But up until this point in the course, you've probably been just drawing a demand curve sloping downwards, pretty standard way, but actually we can get lots of different gradients of demand curves, and this is going to represent different situations where we get we've got D3 here, which is a more elastic demand curve where we have quantity demanded is quite sensitive to changes in price, whereas D2 here is representing a relatively inelastic demand curve where quantity demanded is quite insensitive to changes in price. So we're going to have a look at the different types of products that have those different types of elasticities, but here are a few key terms for you. So elasticity, the whole topic is looking at the extent to which buyers and sellers, usually buyers because we do look at 3 different types of elasticities in the course that are related to demand, so would be relevant for buyers. So price elasticity of demand, income elasticity of demand, and cross price elasticity of demand. And we just look at one, looking at the behaviour of sellers, so price elasticity of supply. But we're looking at how they respond to changes in price or change in other market conditions. So what's really important, some of my students get this a little bit mixed up, but it's this change in price or these other market conditions was a change in income for YED or a change in the price of another product. So we usually call it price of B or product B. But all of the time with these elasticities, the price changes first, or the income changes first, or the price of product B changes first, and then we're going to have a look at how do buyers and sellers respond. It's not the other way around. You could measure it the other way around if you really wanted to, but that's not what this is. Price elasticity of demand, price comes at the beginning of the sentence, so it means that price changes first, then we observe and see how quantity demanded changes. So price elasticity of demand, the definition is the responsiveness of the quantity demanded to a change in the price of a product. And we're always, well, we should, for the purposes of A-level, you should always get a negative figure. So we can actually just forget about that sign. If you want to be really, really correct, you should have a minus sign if it is a PED figure at the beginning, but it doesn't matter that much if you forget to put it on. The figures that we're going to get, we can interpret 2 things about it. One, we can see whether it's price elastic, and this is where a percentage change in the quantity demanded is quite sensitive to a change in a price. So we're going to get a figure of PED above 1, and that means that it's elastic. So it's going to start with 1 point something or 2 point something. Now, strictly speaking, this is actually going to be minus 1 point something or minus 2 point something, but because it should always come out as a minus, lots of people leave off that minus sign. And price inelastic is where a change in the quantity demanded is very insensitive to a change in the price. And for this, you're going to get a number from the equation that starts with 0 point something. Strictly speaking, again, it should be negative 0 point something, but lots of people leave that sign off. So here's the equation: percentage change in quantity demanded over percentage change in price. Again, another danger area where students get this wrong is that they invert it and they do percentage change in price over percentage change in quantity demanded. Don't do that. Remember that price always goes on the bottom. I always say to my students, try and think of, money's the bottom line. Anything to do with money goes on the bottom of these elasticity questions, and then they seem to be able to remember that. Or in symbols here, percentage change in quantity demanded over percentage change in price, just meaning the same thing. So I absolutely love egg sandwiches, so I'm going to base my example around egg sandwiches. So we're going to imagine that the price changes from £1.50 to £1, and as a result of that, the quantity demanded changes to from 200 to 250. Logical, if we look at that, very logical, because we know that demand is downward sloping. When we get a decrease in the price, we should get an increase in quantity demanded. But the question is, by how much? How sensitive is that quantity demanded? So first of all, we need to work out the price change. And I've pre-prepared this. So the price change is 0.5, 50p, divided by the original, which was £1.50. And that gives us minus 0.3 recurring, or if we turn it into a percentage, it's minus 33.33 recurring percent. You can either keep it as decimals, or you can keep it as, or you can change it as percentages. It's fine, but you've got to do the same method for both. When you're working out the price change to the quantity demanded as well. So you wouldn't be able to, divide your percentages by your decimals or decimals by your percentages. You've got to keep it consistent in the equation. So quantity demanded changes, we know it's going to be 50, and we know it's going to be divided by the original, which was 200. There we go. And that's 0.25 divided by, 0.25 or 25%. So PED equation, it's either, you can write it down as 0.25 divided by minus 0.33, or 25% divided by minus 33.33, it should be, and that gives us minus, as we were expecting, 0.75, which when we interpret that, because it begins with a 0, it means it's inelastic. So quantity demand is insensitive to a change in price. Okay, so what can affect elasticity? What kind of things make products elastic or inelastic? Well, these are three of the most prominent factors. So availability of substitutes. So the product tends to be elastic if there are lots of substitutes, because, think about it logically. If the price increases and there's lots of substitutes and there are lots of close substitutes, you can just very easily switch to one of those substitutes products, whereas you can't do much about it if there aren't many substitutes around. So remember, demand is downward sloping, the income and the substitution effect. So if the price goes up, yes, some people are less likely to afford it, but also some people might switch to another substitute product. So if there aren't those substitute products around, quantity demanded won't fall by that much. It would still fall, but it's going to be less of a fall than if it is elastic, if there are lots of substitutes. The price relative to income can also have an effect. So if the price is very high relative to your income, so it's what you would call expensive, you're going to be very sensitive to price changes because it's going to have a big impact on your life. It takes up a lot of your income. Whereas if it's a very small price relative to your income, you might not care. So I always use the example of a box of matches, because boxes of matches are actually really, really cheap. Not surprisingly, there's only a box of matches, but they're like 25p or something. And if that doubled to 50p, and I was at the newsagents buying a box of matches, I wouldn't go, oh my gosh, 50p, I'm not buying it anymore. It's 50p, it's not that much money. So I still buy it. So we're not going to see demand falling by that much. And then time. In the long run, you can change your spending habits, but it's very hard to do that if you're in the short run. So time can be a big factor. The period that you're looking at, have you given consumers enough time to be able to change their spending patterns? So let's look at how we would represent elastic and inelastic on a demand diagram. So this is where we've got perfectly elastic demand. It would be a horizontal line, and this is when we have kind of homogeneous products. We most commonly see this in the second year of the course when we're looking at a market structure called perfect competition, which is actually on your part of the course, but you don't need to learn the diagrams. And this is when we look at the demand for a particular firm's products, and if there are lots of really close substitutes, then there's no difference between them and the products that you're selling. We call it homogeneous, meaning identical products. So this is the only case really where you'd have perfectly elastic demand, because if you put the price up, consumers could just get the identical product from somebody else. So that's why they'd have perfectly elastic demand, whereas this represents just a little bit downward sloping, represents our relatively elastic demand curve. So I always tell students, actually you can remember this, because if you imagine that there's a line there, this looks like a big capital letter E, so elastic. Okay, whereas here, this looks a little bit downward sloping to me actually here, but it's meant to be perfectly vertical. This is perfectly inelastic. So the price really isn't a factor in the demand for this product here. And then this one's relatively inelastic. And I always say to my students, imagine that there's a little thing there. So that looks like an eye now, so inelastic. I for inelastic, and then if you imagine that those letters are there, you don't get confused between the two. This is when we have unitary elasticity or unit elasticity, and this is where PED would equal 1, or to be more exact, it would actually be -1. And this is called a rectangular hyperbola. It's this funny shape, but this is where elasticity all the way along is 1. And actually elasticity changes along the curve. So at the midpoint, elasticity is unitary, so PED equals -1. And above this price, elasticity is elastic, and below this price, elasticity is inelastic. So we can kind of see that there, because if I add a line, kind of looks like an eye shape there, and then this one would join up here, so it kind of, I'm making a bit of a stretch here, kind of looks like an E, but just need to remember above the point of PED equals 1, it's elastic, below the point it's inelastic. So all very interesting, I'm sure you'll agree, but why does this matter? Well, PED can actually help you maximize revenue. So when PED equals 1 or -1, it should be unitary elasticity. This is where revenue is maximized. So actually at this point, and we know that revenue is just price times quantity, this is the maximum revenue that this business could make. So that might be their objective. Might not be. Probably I've got an objective of profit maximization, but if that was their objective and they knew the elasticity of their product, they could actually maximize revenue. So if you know that you've got elastic demand, what you actually want to do is lower the price, and this will increase the revenue. So we've got the price at P1 here, and we can see that this rectangle is smaller than the green rectangle. So lower the price and you can increase the revenue that you gain. And it's the other way around if it's inelastic demand. So we can see that the green rectangle is larger than the red rectangle, meaning that if you have inelastic demand, if you increase the price, you'll be able to increase your revenue. And I'll just take you back to this slide. Actually, some of my students are doing this as a multiple choice question this weekend, and the question was, if PED equals 1 and they change the price, what would happen to revenue? And it doesn't matter if you increase the price or decrease the price, because when PED equals 1, the revenue is maximized. The revenue would actually reduce if you changed away from that point. You'd have a lower, if you decrease the price or you increase the price, you'd have a lower amount of revenue. So we'll see how many of my students have actually watched this video this weekend. So that covers PED, the relationship between PED and total revenue, and the factors that influence the elasticity of demand.